Hello and welcome to Climb's podcast series Advancing Vietnam with me, Vlad Savin, as your host. In this episode, I'm discussing with Rizwan Khan, managing partner at Climb Vietnam, about one of the most interesting market entry models in the Vietnamese context, which is employer record. Rizwan, welcome again to our Advancing Vietnam podcast series.
Thank you very much, Vlad.
Expanding into Vietnam is increasingly attractive for foreign investors. With a solid GDP growth of 8%, in 2025 and a trade turnover of almost 1 trillion USD, Vietnam is positioned as a stable growth market amid global uncertainty. However, entering the market is not always straightforward. Complex labor regulations, regulatory changes, compliance requirements, and the time and cost of setting up a business entity can be daunting and can create barriers for foreign investors. That's where employer record comes into play. In today's episode, I'll discuss with Rizwan how EOR works in practice, what are some of the key use cases for investors entering the market, what are some of the benefits, the risks, and the limitations for investors should be aware of. We'll also discuss when and how companies should consider transitioning from an EOR model into a fully fledged entity. Thank you again, Rizwan, for joining this discussion. Starting with the first and the context of this entire employer record model. What does it mean in practice, an employer record in Vietnamese context for foreign investors?
Vlad, this is very interesting concept. So if an investor wants to start doing business in Vietnam or through Vietnam, so they need to have a legal entity in Vietnam. However, in some cases that is not viable for a variety of reasons. For example, complex regulation, for example, the situation where you are going to test the market. In these circumstances, what an employer can do is that they will contact a client and they can go for employer of record arrangement with the employees. So what happens is that a client Vietnam will host an employee on behalf of a foreign employer, where the employee is working in Vietnam for the employer, but they are being hosted by a client Vietnam. What does it mean? It means that their compliance with the labor regulations, their tax compliance, their social security compliance, all are done by a client Vietnam, but in terms of functions, they are actually reporting to the employer in a foreign country. With this arrangement, what happens is that an employer can enter the market in Vietnam very fast, and they can test the market as well as they can move forward without having a very huge burden of compliance.
That's right. And when does it make sense for investors to use an employer record function versus setting up a legal entity? What are some of those triggers that might reflect that investor strategy into leaning towards employer record?
Sure. There are certain circumstances where a foreign company, they want to come to Vietnam and they want to start the business right away for a variety of reasons. For example, you are moving your supply chain from one particular country to Vietnam, and you have to start right away because you cannot wait for the company to be incorporated, and then you start hiring people. So that is the first situation. The second situation is that employer is not sure whether Vietnam is the right place for them, and they want to test the market. And then based on that, they decide that, okay, Vietnam is the right place for them. There are situations where the investors, they don't want to hire more than 1 or 2 employees, or let's say less than 10 employees. And these situations will not change because of the nature of the business. So, for example, an investor providing a very high-level, sophisticated calibration services for manufacturing companies in Vietnam, and that requires only few people on the ground, and then everything is done in the foreign country. So that is also another situation where they can go for EOR. In certain circumstances, for example, an airline, they want to have a pilot in Vietnam. That situation will not change significantly, and there will not be, let's say, 200 employees in that situation. So the EOR is the right model. Another situation could be where investors have a tight budget and they want to have a fixed cost solution where they don't have to think about compliance of various parts, for example, tax and accounting and other matters. So it really depends on the preferences of the employer. But broadly, we talk about the speed, the flexibility, and controlling the budgets in the short run as well as in the long run.
Absolutely. And also based on my discussions with the investors, particularly in the last 2 years, I see the model is growing more and more as a strategic market entry provision for investors to access the Vietnamese opportunity. And what we see is where investors are looking at hiring just a 1 or 2 headcount, having an entity just to host that very small headcount doesn't make sense commercially.
Yes.
So the headcount is as well a trigger for investors to understanding, are they going to move forward and expand their operations here, or they have very specific niche limit for that headcount. Therefore, it's much more cost effective to host that headcount on somebody else's books and somebody else taking on the risk. We also see investors that want to protect that labor risk. They have operations in the country. They may have manufacturing operations, sourcing, trading, etc. But they do, in certain scenarios, want to insulate themselves from all the risk relevant to employing staff in Vietnam: labor, compliance, salary payments, potential disputes, etc. So for a portion of their workforce, they may adopt a strategy to park them under an employer record third party, like a Climb or others. And therefore, it simplifies their entire strategy for that specific business pillar. And they can concentrate their, let's say, entire business strategy on those pillars that are more important for them. For example, the manufacturing facility.
Right.
We also see investors that are not particularly planning to generate revenue in the domestic market, and they use Vietnam as a cost center or an outsourcing center. In that scenario, if they have 2 or 3 staff that they really want to employ, but they don't particularly want to generate any revenue in the local market, it doesn't make sense specifically to have an entity in that scenario. So they can use that employer record model. So it is beneficial in quite a range of scenarios, but that doesn't mean that having an entity doesn't have its pros, and we can talk later on about that.
Rightly said, Vlad. Another situation could be where a company opens a rep office, but then they are limited by function. So except for 3 functions that the rep office can perform. They can have a representative office in Vietnam performing certain functions, but the parent company wants to do something more than that. So in that case, they can start with EOR before they decide to wrap up the representative office in Vietnam and go for a full-fledged entity. So yes, definitely there are other scenarios that they can go for EOR model.
Let's clarify for our audience the benefit side of the EOR, because that's one of the key questions for investors that we talk with. Why should we go for EOR? What's the real benefit for us in that scenario? And we touched on quite a few. First, speed, right? If you want to access the Vietnamese market with a company, with an entity, you're looking at around 2.5 months process at the minimum. With an employer record model, you're looking at 3.5 days to employ someone, right? If it's a Vietnamese individual,
That's
if it's a foreign individual, it can be longer. So speed to access the market with employer record is significantly improved compared with an entity or a rep office in that scenario. Obviously, the cost function is as well, right? Setting up the fully fledged entity and looking after the compliance on a yearly basis, that adds up versus having a few employees. However, if you have more than 10 employees under employer record, then that cost synergy is more inclined towards having an entity, because you win more on that headcount margin versus that fixed fee for each of the employees that you have. What other benefit would you highlight in this scenario? Probably risk would be one.
Yes, cost synergy may be there when you have more than 10 employees. However, at the same time, when you are hiring someone in Vietnam as for example, a Vietnamese citizen, then the third employment contract becomes indefinite term contract automatically. how you are going to deal with these situations. And some employers, they don't want to hire employees indefinitely. So that is one of the things that they need to consider, whether they want to go for employer of record, a situation where the employment is considered for a short-term labor shortage, and then EOR model comes in. So in order to avoid the situation, litigation through labor courts and others, so that is another benefit that they can go for. Another benefit for that could be the compliance. Compliance in Vietnam could be very complicated. I believe in 2025, there have been more than 100 updates in the regulations and the legal framework occurred. And that makes it very difficult to follow what is going on and how you want to deal with that one. On the same token, when we talk about the personal data privacy compliance, so that becomes another burden on the companies when they are dealing with the employees' personal data, for example, the dependents who are below 14 years of age, etc. So all the whole compliance and the cost and the speed, and then all the other regulatory work that the employer has to perform. In order to avoid that, then EOR is the best solution for employers.
Yeah. And from your experience, what are some of the key industries that are most relevant to take on an employer record function? Is it broadly used, or have you identified, let's say, 4 or 5 industries that are really suitable with this model?
That's an interesting question. The beauty of EOR is that you can use it for pretty much every industry. I would say that 95% of industries you can use it. However, in certain situations where you require a special license, for example, medical services, where you cannot operate through an employer of record. For example, hiring a doctor on EOR model may not be viable. There are certain other professions where you cannot go for EOR model because of the regulatory or the compliance requirement for having special licenses or special conditions to be met with. What I have seen in Vietnam is that whether it's a manufacturing or education or consulting, these industries are very common. If you look at the broader categories, so then definitely tech industry comes on top of that, whether it's fintech or e-commerce or other related industries. Manufacturing is one of the thing, as I have given the example, where you require a very sophisticated calibration. For example, you cannot find many experts in the world, so how can you hire them? So you can go for a rotation basis, for example. So you can hire one person in 10 different countries, for example, and they are rotating from one country to the other, and at the same time fulfilling the local regulations and not violating any of the law that is in force in those countries.
Absolutely. And you mentioned one interesting thing about having multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries, and multiple staff working. That's where the employer record really shines, in this multi-jurisdiction, multi-country level of support of compliance. Instead of investors setting up in each of those countries an entity that may cost $10,000 to $15,000 at the minimum per year to set up and support, and if they have, let's say, Asia Pacific support function for their clients or for their manufacturing facilities, that will create a significant risk management burden, compliance burden, and cost burden. Replacing that with one staff in each of those markets to do the work, but without having that compliance element, it's a significant benefit. So the more exposure investors have across markets, the more beneficial employer record becomes as well for their business model, at least at that entry stage. And we talked about manufacturing as an industry, and we see a lot with some of our clients and with investors coming in. Even when manufacturing investors are expanding their supply chains in Vietnam from China or other regions, that process may take 6 months to 1 year for them to have a fully fledged operational facility. What happens in that time frame where they still need staff, they still need people to be on the ground and to help with that setup, they still need to identify those opportunities to prepare for that 12 months down the line, operational kickstart of their production. That's where employer record really comes in place, because they can hire 2 or 3 key staff without having that entity. Those staff will enable investors to really understand the local market, do the research, and as well help with executing that planning preparation for the production. And then when the setup is finalized, when that company and that facility is in place, then the transition from EOR into a fully fledged operational model is something that a lot of the manufacturing investors really take on.
Indeed, and I can add a little bit on that one. So certain jurisdictions, for example, in Thailand, you have to hire 4 local Thais to have 1 foreign employee. So that means then if you want to have 10 foreigners working for your company, you need to have 40 local staff. So then it becomes quite complicated. So that's where Acclaim Thailand can help employers to go for hiring employees without having that restriction. Another example could be that you are doing a contract manufacturing, but you don't want to have a company, or you don't need a company in Vietnam or any other country. So you can have the quality assurance people who are on the ground, and they make sure that everything is working properly, and you don't have to go for the whole compliance scenario of having the chief accountant and the legal representative and the accounting and tax compliance, payroll compliance. So you don't need to go for all these complications as well as the intricacies, and you can navigate through all these things very easily.
Right. And we talked about a lot about benefits, about opportunities, investors using the model, and it sounds like a very good story in appearance. But what about the limitations? What about the risks? What should foreign investors know about using EOR, particularly in Vietnam, from a risk perspective? Are there any risks with using this model, and potential limitations for them?
Sure. There are risks, there are limitations. So for example, if a parent company wants to do a business in Vietnam and they want to issue an invoice, they cannot do it under EOR model. So that is one of the biggest limitation. What does it mean effectively is that the foreign company will issue an invoice to the Vietnamese customers, and then Vietnamese customers will remit the funds overseas. What I have seen in practice that generally Vietnamese businesses prefer to do business in Vietnam because of the regulation on the foreign exchange control and other matters. So it becomes a little bit more complicated to go for EOR only. Another example could be where you require to have a special license. For example, you need to have a license, let's say from Ministry of Health or Ministry of Education. So there you need to have an entity in Vietnam to avoid that limitation. Another example could be if you are in, let's say, warehousing business, so you may not have that capacity to build the warehouse on EOR model. The same goes with any other businesses where having a special requirement for that particular business, and you need to deal with that. Then we look at the risk that we have is that there may be some cultural clash because the employees are hired by the EOR employer, not with the parent company. So each company they have their own culture, their own working style. The same goes with the IT related matters as well, because then the network of the parent company will be exposed to another EOR company network, and they may have different regulations. For example, they may have a certain compliance. Let's say a parent company is ISO 27001 compliant, and there may not be many companies who are compliant with ISO 27001. Although Acclaim Vietnam, we are fully compliant with ISO 27001 and certified as well. So these are the limitations in terms of technology and operational. The other could be reputation risk, which is the employee when they are terminated. So then they may have some issues with the EOR company, for example, or with the parent company. So that could also be risk for both EOR as well as investor. So it's a very delicate balance, and both EOR companies as well as the investor companies, they need to consider all the risk and rewards and then go for that model.
And one additional limitation under EOR model is that investor can only employ staff under 20 fixed job positions, job titles. Right. They're very broad. They cover generally 80% of the market, starting with project management. That can be almost anything, administration, sales support, quality control, etc. So majority of the activities and the planned scope of work that investors would do in Vietnam can be covered through an employee of record function. However, it is important to understand that if it's a pilot, or if it's a doctor, or if it's a specific educational expert, they may not fit within that 20 job title structure that is licensed by the labor authorities and by the law of investment for EOR service providers. As well, one of the limitations is the timeline of the contract. The 1-year contract, 2-year contracts, generally fixed contracts are issued under employee of record model, and when the transition goes to an indefinite contract, that's when that element of risk exists, not necessarily for the investor, but that becomes a risk of the employee of record provider. And as you said, that balance needs to be taken into consideration, because it's essentially reflecting the entire labor compliance of that employee, but the reputation as well of the foreign investor active in the market.
Sure. And another risk for that is that definitely a client Vietnam is a professional premium corporate services company. We do not do that. However, for some smaller players in the industry, they may give that particular employee to the competitor, because if it is a very highly specialized job where they cannot find people easily, so once the employment is terminated from one particular investor, then that employee is open for the competitor as well to take. So that also something that the employer should go for the companies that are professional in their behavior.
Absolutely. And you mentioned one important thing which reflects data privacy. For investors under employee of record, they can insulate themselves from that full compliance of having an entity and dealing with personal data privacy. However, they rely 100% in this scenario on the third party, the employee of record, that company that takes on that risk of the employees. And therefore, foreign investors need to have that very clear understanding on how the third party is dealing with personal data privacy, because it's becoming a significant compliance requirement, mandatory for all companies that are active in Vietnam, including foreign investors, foreign invested firms that they don't have a presence in Vietnam but have that access to personal data. They need to meet certain compliance requirements as well. So in that scenario, it is important to look at the providers that offer this employee of record service, to look at their licenses, if they're fully licensed, to look at their experience, to look at how they manage personal data privacy, to look at their security systems, because in the end, investors can be insulated but not fully protected from that compliance requirement. If there is a leak, if there is a complaint, if the data is misused in that scenario, in the end, the foreign investor as well has a bind in that entire process and a responsibility as well. More from a reputation perspective, not a dedicated legal responsibility per se. But that's why it is important to really identify solid firms with reputation in the market that can take over the risk of hiring employees on behalf of foreign investors.
Indeed, and not just the data privacy, but the recent AI law in Vietnam is also applicable to employers. These are the things they need to consider. And the regulatory compliance framework is changing very fast in Vietnam. And it's not easy to follow up with that if the employer does not have the full presence here in Vietnam, or they have some corporate services firm that are supporting them to be updated on the regulations.
And the last question, Rizwan, before we take off and we prepare for the next podcast, when should an investor transition from a EOR into a fully fledged entity? What's your experience or advice?
Very good question indeed. And the employer should go for moving to a full-fledged company in Vietnam maybe in 2 months, or they may continue like this for 10 years. It really depends on what their objectives are. In some cases where the the employer grows so big in Vietnam that the EOR model is no longer feasible. So, for example, if you are a tech company and you started with 2 developers, and then now you need to have 200 developers working for you, for example, and it's not just the developers, but the other, let's say, project manager, BA, and other roles. So then, in that case, they should transition to a limited liability company.
That's right. So the scaling of the workforce, it's
Yes.
one of the first triggers where it doesn't make sense as well from a cost, but as well from a risk and management of the entire staff workforce perspective.
Exactly.
To have just a simple EOR model where you don't have that culture building, you don't have that full management structure within the office,
That's
and
right.
that responsibility assignment. You just have a labor compliance function. So that may not be suitable when you have 200 staff versus 2 staff, right? Or 20 staff.
Exactly. Another situation where the business they are working with is subject to a special license. So there may be some businesses that may not require certain licenses, but then later on the government changes the regulation and then they need to have special licenses. So that is the time to move from the EOR model to a full-fledged company. Another example could be where the employer started very small. They never thought that they are going to invoice or bill to a lot of companies in Vietnam, but then they have more clients. Although the workload did not change, the number of employees may not change, but then the scale of clients change. So for the smaller Vietnamese companies, very troublesome to deal with the foreign vendors because of the involvement of foreign contractor, withholding tax and other requirement. So that becomes complicated. So that is another situation. Another example could be where the employer decides that they are ready to expand in the market in Vietnam. So, for example, an education entity, they have business in Ho Chi Minh City only, and then they decide to go for Hanoi and Da Nang and Can Tho. So then the scale becomes bigger of the operations. So that is also another example that they can go for that situation. There are a variety of circumstances where an employer decide to go from EOR model to the full-fledged company, but it mainly goes down to a few factors. For example, the size of the operations. The other situation could be the number of EOR employees working for the employer, then the flexibility that comes with that. So they decide that they don't want to have a certain flexibility where the cost may be a concern. So all these factors will be considered by the employer to decide whether EOR is the right model or a limited liability company is a better model.
And it's important to understand as well that the transition doesn't happen only from EOR into a business entity particularly. Yes, in general, in 90% of the cases, that's the natural flow of developing a business, from understanding the market small scale, and then when that validation is done, then opening up and setting up a structure is something that makes sense. But we see investors as well going the other way around, where they have a representative office for a few years in the market, where they have a entity and a company for 5 or even 10 years, and for various reasons they're choosing to either close down or switch their model into a EOR. There may be reducing their workforce. They may be faced significant challenges in dealing with compliance, with labor requirements, with personal data privacy, with accounting, with tax reporting, etc. And therefore, they're thinking about, are we going to continue the next 5 to 10 years under the same model? Do we have to? Or we can simplify our exposure in the market and switch to EOR. So recently, just last week, I was discussing with a representative office that has existed in Vietnam for over 10 years, and they're looking at closing down the representative office and switching almost 10 employees into an employee of record model. And in that scenario, it basically simplifies the entire compliance of the structure. Employees still keep doing exactly what they've been doing before, but from an investor perspective, that simplification can really offer a peace of mind and a strategic peace of mind in that scenario.
Exactly, and as I discussed earlier, so it could be either moving from EOR to representative office model, or it could be from representative model to limited liability company model, or vice versa. So there are multiple combinations for that. So where an employer may have a permanent establishment in Vietnam, but then they decide that they want to go for EOR model, or they are on EOR model and they decide to go for permanent establishment model. So it really depends on the needs and requirements. And for each such cases at Acclaim Vietnam, we help investors to make an informed decisions based on the risk and rewards attached to each option, and they can choose the right model for themselves.
Rizwan, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining the Advancing Vietnam podcast series.
Thank you very much.
Vietnam continues to present strong opportunities for global businesses, but choosing the right market entry strategy is critical. Whether you are exploring the market, building an initial team, or planning your next phase of growth, understanding how employer of record fits into your overall expansion strategy can make a real difference. Thank you. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on vietnam.acclaim.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or throughout the website contact details.